Hey, I'm Garnet, and for the last 5 years, I have been studying and working in game development full-time. In today's video, I'm going to share with you my journey, specifically the things I've learned along the way and the mistakes that I have made, and how I went from not knowing how to code to making and releasing a game on the MetaQuest store and Steam. I've made a similar video to this in the past, but I've never really discussed the actual learning progression that I had. So get comfortable and allow me to share my journey. I want to start by saying that I don't want this video to be in any way a comparison to your own personal journey, because everyone's experience will be different. But I want to be here to motivate and inspire you to show that you can do this. Prior to studying in 2019, I had made games in Scratch and Unity while I was in high school, but I didn't really learn anything because I wasn't trying to learn anything. In fact, I never even thought about game development as a career path for myself. I've always been a creative, but my medium up until then was film. Whether I was behind a camera, in front of the camera, writing a story, or editing in Final Cut Pro on my 2008 iMac, all I wanted was to make films. In 2019, after randomly tossing up on degrees to study at university, I ended up being accepted to study a Bachelor of Science in Games Development at the University of Technology in Sydney. And that's where my journey begins. My first year of university was filled with a lot of core IT subjects: basic programming in Java, understanding computers through Linux, and the processes for information systems. Now, these first few programming subjects were a good way to introduce us to how code works, but an opinion that I will stick by is that it wasn't taught well. It was kind of based on what you can remember, and there are so many factors to this. You're in a new environment, new learning styles, new people, but it became extremely difficult for me to retain information, so I didn't really learn anything. I could recognize code, but I couldn't figure out what it was doing, why it was doing it, or what certain syntax meant. During the second half of my first year at university, we had a subject that would introduce us to game development through the Unity engine. The way Introduction to Computer Game Development was designed was through these weekly lab tasks where you're given a Unity project and you have a set of instructions split up from a passing grade to full marks. The instructions would be broken down explanations for getting code to work. So it would look something like, in your character controller class, define a private variable named position of type vector2 and RB as a rigid body. In the start method, retrieve the rigid body component attached to the game object. Simple, right? It wasn't for me, because I barely passed every single lab. In fact, there were multiple lab tasks that I just straight up failed. Now, I want to point out that during this time, I was actually a competitive figure skater representing Australia internationally, so my priorities were a little out of order, and university wasn't one of them. But that's no excuse. The reality is, I had a hard time understanding the concepts of basic programming, and quickly found myself trapped in tutorial hell. The big project for this subject was to recreate an arcade game, and I for some reason chose Tetris. Now, conceptually, Tetris is pretty simple. It's just a grid and pieces. But when you actually break down what goes into making these components communicate with each other, it's not that easy. And when you mix that with someone who literally didn't know what a function was, well, you're gonna get a warning from the university for plagiarizing an entire online tutorial. The second part of this project was to add your own spin to the game, and I chose to add new Tetris pieces that altered the game in some way. And I did that literally just by copying the tutorial. I found where the pieces were being made, and I made new ones. I found where the code was for checking complete lines, and I worked from there. And it might sound like I knew what I was doing, but I really didn't. I was able to manipulate the code, but I still didn't know why the code was set up this way, or why the functions looked the way that they did. Here I am, 1 year into studying game development, and I knew nothing. My second year of university started with lockdown and online classes, one of which being Introduction to Computer Game Design. For this subject, I was paired with 3 other people, with the big project being a game focused on principles of good game design. Things like the controls or how mechanics are introduced and explained to the player. My group came up with a super simple platformer where each level introduces a new feature to the player. I was designated the opening level and my feature was bounce pads. And you think I knew how to code a bounce pad? I could barely even get a circle to move. Of course I didn't. Back to the tutorials to try and figure out how to make a bounce pad. And I got it in the game, but I still had no idea what I was doing. And I think that's going to be a common theme here. I could not understand how or why things would work or wouldn't work. There was also another subject during the semester that would introduce us to data structures and algorithms in C++ through Dijkstra's algorithm. I could barely figure out the Unity engine, and now I have to implement a full pathfinding algorithm in a programming language I have never touched. Suffice to say, I asked people for help. Some tried, others just told me to give up. But I'm going to touch up on that in a second. I barely scraped through the class, seriously barely scraped through, and here I am, halfway through my degree, feeling like I know nothing. Everyone seems to be getting it, and I'm not. And it's hard not to think in a time like that I'm just not cut out for this. The second half of my degree, I took a subject called Advanced Games Programming, which was taught in Unreal Engine and C++. After nearly failing data structures and algorithms the semester before, I was not keen to work in C++ again. The subject was designed a lot like the first year game development subject in that there were weekly lab tasks with instructions for different grading levels depending on how much you submit. Now, I have to say, the first few weeks were actually not too bad. They were quite generous with how descriptive the instructions were. I still struggled, but I was at least able to complete the lab tasks. Now, remember when I said some people told me to just give up? There was something about that almost broke me, but not broke me down, but broke something in my brain. It broke the barrier of me telling myself I can't do this, because now I had something to prove to not just myself. I spent time doing these lab tasks and going out of my way to truly understand how and why the code was working the way it was. And at some point, something started to click. It wasn't immediate, but I was starting to understand the code. For this subject, the assignments were actually built off the weekly labs. So each week you would build on the same project bit by bit until the last week you would have a fully fleshed out game. One of the lab tasks got us to build a randomly generated map with different curves and heights, and this really fascinated me, and understanding procedural generation became a new obsession. So one of the assignments got us to include our own procedurally generated content, and I came up with an idea for potions that would spawn in the map for the enemy to try and find if their health was low. 18 months into my degree, 18 months into learning programming, and for the first time, I had escaped tutorial hell. I created a system where I came up with it and didn't look at a tutorial. Things were beginning to make sense. For this assignment, I got 19 out of 20, the second highest mark in the entire class, and for the first time in this degree, I felt validated that I was on the right track and that I was actually learning something. And for the next few months, I let that momentum take over. In 2021, I started off feeling confident in myself. Even if looking back, I still really didn't know too much, I knew enough to understand what I was doing and why I was doing it. Like I said, I had started to learn about procedural generation and different algorithms, and it became almost like an obsession. During this semester, I took my first capstone subject, Game Design Studio 1. For this subject, we kinda got free rein to make any game we want from everything we've learned in the degree. The group I was with came up with Thorm, a roguelike dungeon crawler, and I tried to take on as much programming for this project as possible. I was excited, I had this motivation to create something amazing, and I wanted to be able to create a project that I was proud of. I took on programming and designing a lot of the enemies, and for this I basically spent time learning the A-star pathfinding algorithm, which is pretty similar to Dijkstra's, but again, after nearly failing data structures and algorithms 1 year prior, I could see this as a way to redeem myself. I was still looking at tutorials and online resources, but now it was a different purpose. Not to copy, but to actually understand why. And I managed to actually get a fully working A-star pathfinding implementation into the game, and I was able to create something like 15 different enemies and 4 different bosses, all that utilized a state machine to handle multiple behaviors. Honestly, it was cool, and I still think it's a really fun game to play. After this subject and during the semester break, for the first time in my 2 and a bit years of university, I wanted to keep refining my programming skills outside of class. Inspired by our project Thorm and an idea that we had to scrap early on, and of course staying true with my obsession with procedural generation, I wanted to explore randomly generated maps. I took time attempting and learning a few of my own designs before I stumbled across the random walker algorithm. I did a bit of research on that and actually managed to make my own implementation for it as well. Now, I'm over 2.5 years into my degree, and this was the first time that I went out of my way to do extra study. And I can't help but wonder where I would be if I did that 2.5 years ago. But I wouldn't have even known where to start. And maybe you're in that position too. So let me help by talking about today's sponsor, Brilliant.org. Brilliant has thousands of interactive lessons that range from fundamental math and science to complex code and AI to better understand what it takes to be a programmer. The biggest problem I faced when I started programming was that I could never understand what I was doing, but that's where Brilliant fills a gap. Every course is interactive and highly visual, making it way more engaging and easier to learn in. Something I do in my day-to-day life now, which I wish I did when I first started programming, is just opening up a project. Even something as simple as 5 minutes of work can stack up, and that's a learning model behind Brilliant. Whether you're working or studying full-time, every lesson is tailored around you. After using Brilliant for some time, it's hard to pick which is my favorite out of all of the programming courses on offer, but I have to say I have never felt more confident in my own programming skills, simply through my short daily lessons in Brilliant. If you want to jump in and try this yourself, Brilliant offers a full 30-day free trial when you visit brilliant.org/garnet. And if you sign up, you will also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thank you, Brilliant, for supporting the channel. Now, back to the video. 2.5 years later, and I'm in my final semester of university with my second capstone subject, Game Design Studio 2. This subject was identical to the previous capstone subject, but slightly more time in actually making the game. And with the momentum that my group had from Thorm, we decided to stay together to work on the next project. This time, it would challenge everything I had learned up until this point, because we decided on a multiplayer arena fighter set in the Roman Colosseum. Not only was this my first time outside of 2D development in Unity, but I'm also working in an online multiplayer environment. Being confident in myself, I again wanted to take on as much of the programming as possible. I wanted to keep learning and absorbing knowledge, so I ended up being responsible for a lot of the multiplayer network code. I did a lot of how the game states communicated with each other, and how the messages are sent across different servers. Now, if you have any experience with network code, then you will know that the natural way of programming needs to be sort of altered. You're not just thinking about the editor, but real-time servers. What one person sees isn't necessarily what the other person will see, and you need to always ensure that messages are being sent and received from all ends, which means a lot of testing. I remember at one point I had 3 computers running so that I could handle every edge case I could think of. It was pretty painful, but at the same time, I loved this, because it really forced me to think deeper into programming and be very careful about the actual structure of my code, because something as simple as code order could and would break the game. Learning all this was a bit more difficult as well because I couldn't be as reliant on simple tutorials, but instead I began learning how to read and understand different documentation. Another successful semester down, and a big shout out to my friends on their projects in this subject, which kept me super motivated throughout development. I got to the end of my degree, and from not knowing anything about programming for the first 1.5 years to making a fully networked multiplayer game, I felt pretty good. My next goal now was to get a job as a game developer, and I was fully aware of the nature of this industry, so I knew it wouldn't be an overnight thing. In fact, it took me nearly 1.5 years before I got a job, but we'll get to that. My immediate goal was to just keep learning. I knew there was still so much about game development that I was still yet to learn. One of the first things I did as a little nod to 2019 me was to remake Tetris. Around this time, I was really interested in grids and arrays, and I remember thinking that broken down, Tetris is effectively just a 2-dimensional array, and I wanted to try making it like that. The idea that I was going with was that if you took all of the Unity engine away, the game should still be playable because it's not reliant on the engine itself. I remember around this time as well, I saw a lot of videos on YouTube about game development progression, and there was one where someone talked about John Conway's The Game of Life, and how they reimagined that into an ecosystem simulation. And this was super fascinating to me, and simulations and artificial intelligence became my next learning obsession. I learned all about The Game of Life, and I wanted to try it out myself. Being inspired as well by this ecosystem simulation video that I saw, I tried to do something similar in a 2D version. It was also around this time that I was interested in improving my user interface and user experience skills. I took some time trying to build a fleshed out version that was satisfying but also looked and felt good. Around mid-2022, I was also having a few job interviews, and some required me to make a game based on an outline. Simple games like Pong or a Match 3 type game. But I took these as opportunities to build on different skills, regardless if I was going to get the job or not. For Pong, I spent time building a smart AI, as well as some really nice visuals and graphics to match an arcade game. I also heard about editor tools, but I couldn't quite figure out a use case for them. Then when it came to making this Match 3 game, and I was hand designing these levels, I thought, maybe I could automate this. Maybe I could create some kind of interface that would allow me to create levels based on prompts that I give it. And that's what I was able to do. And again, it was pretty difficult as there weren't too many tutorials available for editor tools, and ChatGPT wasn't around yet, so I had to keep getting better at reading and understanding documentation and research reports. I'm 1 year out of uni now, don't have a job yet, but I felt like I had gained a lot of valuable information, and I at least knew I was doing everything I could to make myself a better candidate. At the start of 2023, I had an idea to create a game in a day, so I decided to create a tower defense game. I made a video on this as well, which you can see here, but this game isn't what's important. It's what came from this game. Shortly after releasing it, I created a new Unity project based on it and started bringing some of the ideas over. Quickly, the game kind of took on a life of its own, and to this day, I'm still working on it and release frequent devlogs on the game. But this game is what helped me land the job I'm working at today. Around March of that year, I applied to work at Tin Man Games, and in April, I got a call back for a technical interview. During the interview, they asked me to present a project I'm proud of, and I showed them an early iteration of this tower defense game I was working on. I explained the process behind the code, why I made certain design decisions, and I actually got the job. I probably applied to over 50 jobs before I got this role, but I had made it. I started working at Tin Man Games as a gameplay and tools programmer on their project Neon Squad Tactics, and even in the lead up to starting this job, the imposter syndrome started to take over. I was flooded with thoughts of not being good enough, not earning this position. You name it, I felt it. So when I started and spent time looking over the codebase, it was true. I realized how little I knew. But here's the thing, when you're hired as a junior or a grad, you're not hired for what you know, you're hired for your potential. Up until that point, I went from literally not knowing how to code to being able to put together systems in countless ways. So again, I spent time learning, understanding, and every day I got a little bit more comfortable. And this is the time that I started to learn about interfaces, dictionaries, delegates and actions, and more importantly, scalable code. Let me take you back a minute. In 2020, during my introduction to computer game design class, while we were making a platformer, Coffee Rush, we had a collectible system in the levels, which were these little coffee beans. The guy that wrote the system, a much better programmer than me, made it so that it was reusable and adaptable for any level. I remember when I was making my level, I looked at what he made and saw how he put the collectibles together, and it never occurred to me that it was a reusable object. So I started coding up a similar system for my level when he stopped me and was like, just drag in my prefab into your scene and put all the collectibles into it. And it blew my mind. How does it know how to do that? How can it work in this scene and work in this other scene, but they're not looking for the same thing? When I started working with Tin Man, I worked alongside the game designer. And game designers are great because they have that non-linear way of thinking. They think of every weird use case possible and are the brains behind the system that can make it possible. So he asked me to write a system to retrieve tile data from the tiles. And being a literal thinker, my brain was defaulting to, what data do you need? But he was the one that forced a different way of thinking. It could be anything. Create a universal way to retrieve unknown data. And again, my mind is blown. I've just fallen into my newest and latest obsession. Now when I'm programming or designing systems, be it at Tin Man or my own personal projects, I'm constantly thinking of the design and structure of the code itself. How can I make this usable outside of my immediate use case? There's so much more that I've learned during my time at Tin Man, asynchronous programming, actions, general practices, and all of these come naturally with the demands of the project. But every day, I aim to learn a little bit more and better myself as a game developer. I'm also really proud to announce that with the team at Tin Man, we released Neon Squad Tactics on the MetaQuest store in June of this year, on PC VR through Steam in September, and I'm currently in charge of porting the game to PC, which will hopefully be released in the coming few months. You've heard my journey, and now I want to leave you with a few words. First off, like I said, everyone's journey is going to be different. It took me 18 months before I could even look at code. Some people will get it within a day, some people longer. But there's no such thing as you're not good enough. I didn't touch too much on specific resources that I used because again, everyone will be different, but I can say that there was no one magic book or tutorial that helped me. For me, it was a combination of time, exposure to code, and a lot of hard work. I also want to make a point about tutorials. I followed tutorials for a long time, and even now I will watch certain tutorials. But is that a bad thing? Definitely not, because they're there to help you. And once you get to a comfortable stage of programming, you use the tutorial as a resource to assist in your own knowledge, not as just a copy step-by-step guide. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you have any questions, leave a comment down below or join my Discord, which will be linked in the description. And while you're clicking some buttons, if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to the channel to stay up to date with more videos like this one. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you all very soon. Take care.